The parish hall fell into that peculiar silence which follows genuine shock, a silence more absolute than mere quiet, as though the very air itself had been compressed into something heavy and suffocating. Dr. Malcolm Ashworth, the village physician, who had been enjoying his soup with the satisfaction of a man who appreciated both good sustenance and good company, rose from his seat with the practiced calm of someone accustomed to emergencies, though his face had assumed that particular pallor which betrays the presence of something far graver than a simple fainting spell. Mary Fellows, still trembling from her discovery, repeated her account with increasing incoherence. How she had knocked upon the study door, received no answer, had entered to find Lady Catherine lying as though in repose upon the burgundy chaise lounge, and how the pale blue swan feather had rested upon her pillow with an arrangement so deliberate that it could hardly have arrived there by accident. Miss Marple, who had risen from her seat with considerably less fanfare than the other villagers, observed the various reactions with the meticulous attention to detail that had served her so well in matters of human behavior. Sir Geoffrey had gone quite white, his hand gripping the edge of the table with sufficient force to cause his knuckles to blanch, though whether this indicated genuine shock or a performance of shock remained, in Miss Marple's estimation, an open question. Thomas Whitmore had begun to rise from his seat and then appeared to reconsider, sinking back down with the air of a man who had been simultaneously struck and steadied by an invisible force. Young Eleanor Bramwell had gasped, a small controlled sound, and her eyes had immediately sought out Thomas Whitmore's, a connection of such clear intensity that it could not have been more obvious had she drawn an arrow between them. Mr. Bernard Thorne, the solicitor, had reached for his water-glass with mechanical precision and drained it entirely, as though attempting to satisfy a sudden and desperate thirst. Dr. Ashworth, after a preliminary examination in the study that lasted no more than 3 minutes, emerged with the confirmation that Lady Catherine was indeed deceased and that the circumstances surrounding her death were sufficiently unusual to warrant notification of the constabulary. The doctor's expression suggested that he was quite familiar with death in its natural manifestations, but considerably less acquainted with death arranged with such peculiar theatrical attention. Within the hour, Inspector Samuel Caldwell of the County Police had arrived at the parish hall, a man of perhaps 50 years whose methodical approach to criminal investigation was matched only by his profound skepticism regarding anything that deviated from conventional explanation. Inspector Caldwell possessed that particular quality of many police officers whereby they viewed anything unusual as merely a complication to be dispensed with rather than a mystery to be unraveled. He examined the study with the thoroughness one might expect, photographed the feather in its precise position upon the pillow, and took preliminary statements from the vicar, Mrs. Hartwell, and several of the more prominent citizens. The inspector's initial theory, expressed with the confidence of a man who had solved more cases than he could easily count, was that Lady Whitmore had suffered a sudden cardiac event and that the feather was merely an unrelated peculiarity. Perhaps she had been working on some needlework project, and it had fallen upon her pillow as she collapsed. This explanation possessed a certain superficial plausibility, the sort of logic that appealed to practical minds uncomplicated by excessive contemplation. However, Dr. Ashworth's more detailed examination, conducted in the presence of Inspector Caldwell and the vicar, revealed that Lady Catherine had ingested a substance that the doctor could not immediately identify, but which had almost certainly contributed to her demise. The presence of poison, for that was what the circumstances increasingly suggested, transformed the matter from a simple domestic tragedy into something requiring considerably more attention. Inspector Caldwell's confidence, which had seemed so unshakable moments before, began to manifest cracks that became increasingly visible as the implications settled upon him, like the fine dust of chalk upon a dark suit. The question of the swan feather remained, a detail so peculiar that it seemed to mock conventional explanation. Where had it originated? Lady Whitmore possessed no swan, nor had anyone observed her keeping feathers as part of any decorative scheme. The deliberate placement upon her pillow suggested intention rather than accident, and yet to what purpose? Inspector Caldwell's inquiries into this particular matter met with blank stares from the assembled villagers, none of whom could account for the feather's presence or its significance. Miss Marple, who had remained at the parish hall throughout the afternoon under the pretext of assisting Mrs. Hartwell with the increasingly chaotic arrangements, observed that the feather seemed to trouble the inspector rather more than the actual fact of the poisoning. Human behavior, in Miss Marple's long experience, revealed far more through its inconsistencies than through its apparent logic. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, and the parish hall took on the atmosphere of a minor crime scene, Inspector Caldwell announced that he would require formal statements from all those who had been present at the festival, and that he would be establishing himself at the village police station for at least the following week. Sir Geoffrey Whitmore had been requested to remain at the hall, ostensibly to answer preliminary questions about his wife's habits and possible enemies, though the inspector's tone suggested that Sir Geoffrey held a position of considerable interest in his preliminary calculations. Thomas Whitmore had been instructed to remain available for further questioning, as had Bernard Thorne and Eleanor Bramwell. The village of Ashford-upon-Meadow, which had begun the day celebrating the harvest with the comfortable certainty of small-town tradition, now found itself transformed into something quite different, a place where secrets that had been carefully buried beneath decades of social convention suddenly seemed far more fragile and exposed than anyone had anticipated. The evening had settled over Ashford-upon-Meadow with that particular quality of autumn darkness which seemed to arrive with unexpected abruptness, as though day had been rather hastily replaced by night without the customary twilight transition. Miss Marple had returned to her cottage at 6:30, having excused herself from the parish hall with the gentle firmness that decades of living had taught her was the most effective manner of departure. The village, she reflected as she settled herself in her sitting room with a cup of chamomile tea, was already beginning to reshape itself around the fact of Lady Whitmore's death, as villages invariably do when confronted with genuine tragedy. Within hours, the official narrative was already forming. Whispered conversations in the post office, urgent telephone calls conducted in undertones, and the particular brand of speculation that emerges when ordinary people encounter circumstances that exceed their ordinary experience. Mary Fellows, who had arrived at Miss Marple's cottage within 20 minutes of tea, Former's departure from the parish hall, carried with her the most recent and elaborate theories regarding the poisoning. It must have been Sir Geoffrey, Mary asserted, settling herself into the wing-back chair across from Miss Marple with the confidence of one who had solved a complex puzzle through the application of pure intuition. The man was positively ghastly when they told him about Catherine. One could see it in his face, guilty as sin. Miss Marple, who had observed Sir Geoffrey's reaction with considerably more nuance than her companion, merely nodded and continued her knitting, a response that had the effect of encouraging Mary to elaborate further. According to Mary's version of events, Sir Geoffrey had maintained a mistress in the neighbouring town of Meadowbrook for the past 2 years, this information having been acquired through the reliable mechanism of village gossip, which, if not always accurate in its specific details, possessed a remarkable facility for approximating general truths. Lady Catherine, the theory continued, had discovered the affair and had threatened to divorce her husband, thereby imperiling his access to her considerable inheritance, which had originated from her mother's side of the family and remained, through the particular provisions of a trust established in 1952, entirely within Lady Catherine's control. This motivation, Mary concluded with satisfaction, seemed both clear and compelling. However, Miss Marple had observed several details that complicated this otherwise tidy narrative. Sir Geoffrey's mistress, assuming such a woman existed, would have possessed her own motivations entirely separate from those of the cuckolded spouse, and the particular method of murder, poison administered with apparent subtlety, combined with the deliberate placement of the swan feather, suggested a level of psychological complexity that seemed somewhat at variance with a man of Sir Geoffrey's relatively straightforward temperament. Moreover, Miss Marple had noted during the afternoon's events that Sir Geoffrey had appeared genuinely disoriented by his wife's death, a quality quite distinct from the calculated shock that a premeditated murderer might be expected to display. Thomas Whitmore's behavior, by contrast, had revealed far more interesting complexities. His initial shock had given way rather quickly to a sort of controlled composure, and his glances toward Eleanor Bramwell had suggested a connection of considerably more intimate nature than mere village acquaintance. The question of Thomas Whitmore's financial situation was one that interested Miss Marple considerably, though she had said nothing to Mary regarding her observations. A man who had spent 15 years away from his native village and had recently returned with the air of one who had been pursuing various theatrical enterprises was a man whose financial circumstances were likely to be considerably straitened. Lady Catherine, if the village gossip regarding family relationships could be credited, had maintained a substantial allowance for Thomas during his years in London, an allowance that would have ceased upon her death, with control of such matters presumably reverting to Sir Geoffrey. This motivation, while perhaps less obvious than that attributed to Sir Geoffrey himself, possessed a certain understated logic that appealed to Miss Marple's sense of how human beings actually behaved. Eleanor Bramwell, too, presented a figure of considerable interest. A woman of 30 years whose romantic prospects had been damaged by a broken engagement was a woman whose desperation might manifest in unexpected ways. Her connection to Thomas Whitmore, evident in the intensity of their afternoon conversation, suggested possibilities that extended beyond innocent friendship. If Thomas and Eleanor harbored romantic intentions toward one another, and if Lady Catherine's death resulted in a reversal of Thomas's financial circumstances, then Eleanor's interests and Thomas's interests might be recognized as substantially aligned. Yet this too seemed to Miss Marple incomplete, a partial explanation that failed to account for the particular deliberation suggested by the Swan Feather. The feather itself remained the most troubling element of the crime, at least from an investigative standpoint. Inspector Caldwell, during his preliminary examination, had made several inquiries regarding its origin, and while several villagers had mentioned observing decorative feathers in the homes of various residents, none had been able to account for a pale blue swan feather in particular. Miss Marple had taken note of a small detail that seemed to escape everyone else's attention. When Eleanor Bramwell had been questioned about her movements during the fatal hour, she had glanced quite involuntarily at the small vase of dried grasses and ornamental feathers that decorated Mrs. Hartwell's study desk. This glance had been momentary and seemingly unconscious, yet it suggested that Eleanor possessed knowledge regarding the feather's origin that she had chosen, quite deliberately, not to articulate to Inspector Caldwell. Bernard Thorne, the solicitor, had been occupied throughout the afternoon with quiet consultations with Sir Geoffrey, discussions that appeared to concern matters of considerably more significance than the immediate investigation into Lady Catherine's death. A solicitor consulted in the wake of a murder, Miss Marple reflected, was invariably involved in the complex untangling of financial arrangements and legal implications that such events necessarily produced. By 9 o'clock that evening, Inspector Caldwell had a stab, lished a preliminary timeline suggesting that Lady Catherine had consumed the poison sometime between 12 o'clock noon and 1 o'clock afternoon, placing her death squarely within the window of the Harvest Festival proceedings when multiple suspects had possessed both opportunity and proximity to the victim. The following morning arrived with that particular quality of clarity that sometimes follows tragedy, as though the universe itself had adjusted its optics to render everything in sharper focus. Miss Marple had slept poorly, her mind engaging in that restless nocturnal activity which characterizes the contemplation of complex human motivations and their criminal manifestations. She had risen at 6 o'clock, as was her custom, and had taken her breakfast in the garden room while observing the frost that had crystallized across the lawn overnight, each blade of grass rendered temporarily brilliant by its coating of ice. By 8 o'clock she had received a telephone call from Inspector Caldwell requesting her presence at the police station, a summons that was both unexpected and, in Miss Marple's estimation, entirely predictable. The inspector had apparently learned that Miss Marple possessed some minor reputation for unraveling village mysteries, a reputation that the constabulary generally viewed with a mixture of skepticism and grudging acknowledgement. When Miss Marple arrived at the modest brick building that served as Ashford-upon-Meadows police station, she found Inspector Caldwell in a state of considerable frustration, his preliminary investigation having revealed complications that his initial theories had failed to adequately address. The poison, according to Dr. Ashworth's more detailed analysis conducted during the night, had been administered through the consumption of a small pastry, specifically a lemon tart of the sort that had been served at the Harvest Festival luncheon. This revelation had transformed the investigation from a matter of identifying a single poisoned item to the considerably more complex task of determining precisely which lemon tart had been doctored and by whom. The festival luncheon had included approximately 30 lemon tarts, each identical in appearance, distributed among the assembled villagers with no systematic method of tracking which individual had consumed which particular pastry. Inspector Caldwell's frustration was palpable as he elaborated upon this discovery, his earlier confidence having given way to the recognition that he was confronted with a problem of considerably greater complexity than a simple murder. "The difficulty, Miss Marple," the inspector explained with the careful articulation of a man attempting to maintain professional composure, "is that Lady Catherine could have consumed any one of those tarts at any point during the hour preceding her death. She was observed moving about the parish hall, speaking with various individuals, and at no point was she confined to a single location where her consumption of a particular pastry could be precisely documented." Miss Marple, who had been listening with her customary patient attention, made a small observation that the inspector had apparently overlooked. Had Lady Catherine a particular preference regarding food, Inspector? Perhaps certain items that she favored above others? This seemingly innocent inquiry had the effect of causing Inspector Caldwell to pause and consider a dimension of the problem that had not previously occupied his thoughts. After several telephone calls to Sir Geoffrey and various other villagers, a pattern began to emerge. Lady Catherine had indeed possessed definite preferences regarding food. She had been averse to excessive sugar, having once mentioned to several acquaintances her concern about maintaining her figure, and she had a particular fondness for lemon flavoring precisely because it provided tartness without excessive sweetness. This preference, while seemingly insignificant, suggested that Lady Catherine would have been considerably more likely to consume a lemon tart than other available pastries. Moreover, Sir Geoffrey had mentioned, somewhat reluctantly, that his wife had made a particular point of consuming at least one of Mrs. Hartwell's famous lemon tarts whenever the opportunity presented itself, regarding them as a minor indulgence that fit within her dietary parameters. This information transformed the investigation considerably. If Poisoner had possessed knowledge of Lady Catherine's preferences, knowledge that would have been available to anyone residing in the village or moving within its social circles, then the crime suggested a level of premeditation considerably more sophisticated than a random act of violence. Someone had anticipated Lady Catherine's behavior, had predicted with reasonable confidence that she would consume a specific pastry, and had poisoned that particular item with the deliberate intention of bringing about her death. This revelation drew Miss Marple's attention toward the question of access. The lemon tarts had been prepared by Mrs. Hartwell in her kitchen, transported to the parish hall, and arranged upon the serving table at approximately 11:30 in the morning. During the period between their preparation and their distribution, access to the tarts had been available to anyone who possessed opportunity and inclination. Miss Marple inquired politely regarding which individuals had been present in the parish hall during the hour preceding the luncheon service. Inspector Caldwell provided a list that included Mrs. Hartwell herself, her niece Eleanor Bramwell, several of the festival committee members, including Bernard Thorne, and, somewhat surprisingly, Thomas Whitmore, who had apparently arrived at the hall early ostensibly to assist with various arrangements. This information regarding Thomas Whitmore's presence proved particularly interesting to Miss Marple, as it contradicted his earlier statement that he had arrived only moments before the luncheon was scheduled to commence. When pressed regarding this discrepancy, Thomas had explained with obvious discomfort that he had indeed arrived early but had been occupied in private conversation and had forgotten to mention this detail. His obvious reluctance to elaborate upon the nature of this private conversation suggested dimensions of the matter that extended beyond the simple question of his presence at the crime scene. Further investigation revealed that Thomas had been observed in animated discussion with Eleanor Bramwell near the kitchen storage area at approximately 11 o'clock. a conversation that had terminated rather abruptly upon the arrival of Mrs. Hartwell. The nature of this conversation remained undisclosed by both parties, though Eleanor's subsequent demeanor had suggested something approaching anxiety. By midday, Inspector Caldwell had begun to focus his investigative efforts primarily upon Thomas Whitmore, viewing him as the most likely perpetrator based upon his financial motivation, his presence at the crime scene during the critical period, and his apparent attempt to conceal certain details regarding his morning activities. Sir Geoffrey, while not entirely exonerated, had begun to recede somewhat from the inspector's primary focus, his position as suspect complicated by the apparent absence of any definitive motive that could rival Thomas Whitmore's financial desperation. Miss Marple, however, maintained her customary skepticism regarding premature conclusions, and she requested permission to conduct several inquiries of her own before Inspector Caldwell proceeded further with his investigation. Inspector Caldwell, despite his inclination towards swift resolution, possessed sufficient professional respect for Miss Marple's previous successes to grant her a degree of latitude in her inquiries, though his agreement came accompanied by the barely concealed irritation of a man who preferred his investigations to proceed according to established procedural protocols. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the afternoon engaged in a series of seemingly casual conversations with various villagers, inquiries that possessed the superficial character of idle gossip, but which were, in fact, meticulously constructed to extract specific information regarding the events preceding Lady Catherine's death. Her first call was upon Mrs. Hartwell, the vicar's wife, ostensibly to express sympathy regarding the tragedy that had occurred during her carefully orchestrated festival arrangements. During this visit, conducted over tea in Mrs. Hartwell's sitting room, Miss Marple inquired with apparent innocence regarding the preparation of the lemon tarts. Mrs. Hartwell, relieved to discuss matters other than the murder, explained in considerable detail her process for creating the pastries, which she had begun the previous evening and completed early that morning. The tarts had been arranged upon a serving platter at approximately 10 o'clock, covered with a muslin cloth to protect them from dust, and had been left in the kitchen while Mrs. Hartwell attended to other final arrangements for the festival. At this point, Miss Marple made a seemingly trivial observation. "How very fortunate that the muslin cloth protected them," she remarked. "Surely the kitchen must have been occupied by various helpers throughout the morning." Mrs. Hartwell's response was instructive. She admitted, "Some." What reluctantly that Eleanor had spent considerable time in the kitchen that morning, ostensibly helping to prepare serving dishes and platters, though Mrs. Hartwell acknowledged that she had been occupied with other matters and could not account with certainty for every moment of her niece's presence or activities. Miss Marple's next visit was to Bernard Thorne's office on the High Street, where she conducted what appeared to be a consultation regarding the management of her modest financial affairs. During this appointment, she mentioned almost in passing that she had been observing the village's considerable interest in the Whitmore family's circumstances, and she wondered aloud whether Sir Geoffrey's financial position was as secure as the village generally assumed. Mr. Thorne, constrained by professional discretion, yet unable entirely to resist the opportunity to discuss matters of significance, provided certain carefully guarded responses that suggested Sir Geoffrey's financial situation was considerably more complex than public perception indicated. The retired banker, it transpired, had invested heavily in several ventures that had not achieved the anticipated returns, and his personal wealth, while still considerable, was not infinite. More significantly, Mr. Thorne indicated with careful circumlocution that Lady Catherine's estate, which would now devolve to Sir Geoffrey through the normal processes of inheritance, represented a considerably more substantial portion of the Whitmore family's total resources than might have been generally understood. This information, combined with Miss Marple's prior knowledge regarding Thomas's allowance structure, suggested financial motivations considerably more intricate than Inspector Caldwell had initially recognized. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Miss Marple had arranged a seemingly chance encounter with Eleanor Bram. At the village library, where she discovered the younger woman engaged in apparently purposeless examination of historical volumes. Miss Marple, settling herself in a nearby chair with a book of poetry, commenced a gentle conversation regarding Eleanor's romantic disappointments and her current situation in the village. Eleanor, who had maintained a somewhat guarded demeanor since the discovery of Lady Catherine's body, gradually relaxed under Miss Marple's patient and sympathetic questioning. During their conversation, Eleanor revealed a detail of considerable significance. She had, in fact, been engaged to a young man whom she had genuinely loved, and his subsequent marriage to another had indeed caused her considerable pain. However, Eleanor elaborated, she had recently begun to hope that her circumstances might improve, that new possibilities might emerge if certain obstacles were removed. This carefully veiled reference to anticipated change suggested Eleanor's knowledge of developments that had not yet publicly manifested. When Miss Marple asked with gentle directness whether these new possibilities involved Thomas Whitmore, Eleanor's response was a long silence followed by an admission, reluctant yet sincere, that she and Thomas harbored romantic feelings toward one another and had begun to contemplate a future together. However, Eleanor continued with obvious distress. Such a future had been contingent upon financial circumstances that had seemed impossibly distant, until Lady Catherine's death had suddenly rendered them conceivable. This admission, while illuminating regarding Eleanor's emotional state and her connection to Thomas, also raised troubling questions regarding the degree of her foreknowledge or involvement in events that had culminated in Lady Catherine's demise. By the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage that evening, she had accumulated a considerable array of observations and had begun to perceive patterns that suggested dimensions of the case considerably more complex than the straightforward narrative of Thomas Whitmore's guilt that Inspector Caldwell appeared to be constructing. The question of the Swan Feather remained, troubling and deliberate, as though positioned specifically to convey information to those sufficiently observant to recognize its significance. Miss Marple settled herself before her sitting-room fire with her knitting, her needles clicking in that characteristic rhythm that seemed to assist her mental processes, and she contemplated the peculiar architecture of motivations and deceptions that the investigation had thus far revealed. By 9 o'clock that evening, a developing theory had begun to coalesce in her mind. A theory that suggested the poisoning of Lady Catherine represented not a simple act of desperation, but rather a carefully orchestrated conspiracy that involved multiple participants, each acting upon their own distinct motivations, yet collectively contributing toward a single criminal outcome. The second day of the investigation dawned with a quality of tension that had begun to permeate the village with almost palpable intensity, as though the very atmosphere had absorbed the anxieties and suspicions that murder inevitably generates within small communities. Miss Marple had slept fitfully, her mind engaged in that peculiar nocturnal activity which characterizes the final stages of complex reasoning, and she had risen with the conviction that a critical piece of information remained obscured, a detail that would ultimately prove decisive in distinguishing truth from deception. The pale blue swan feather continued to occupy her thoughts with disproportionate insistence, for it represented precisely the sort of deliberate theatrical gesture that suggested an individual of considerable psychological complexity and emotional investment in the crime's commission. At 9 o'clock that morning, Miss Marple received a visit from Mary Fellows, who arrived in a state of considerable agitation bearing information acquired through the village's most reliable mechanism of information dispersal. "You shall not believe what I have discovered," Mary declared, settling herself into Miss Marple's sitting room with the air of one who possessed knowledge of genuine significance. According to Mary's account, she had encountered Mrs. Hartwell's housemaid at the market that morning, and the young woman had revealed that Lady Catherine had visited the vicarage on the afternoon preceding the harvest festival, ostensibly to consult with Mrs. Hartwell regarding certain festival arrangements. However, according to the housemaid's observations, the conversation had been anything but cordial, and both women had emerged from the vicar's study with expressions suggesting considerable agitation. This information proved particularly illuminating to Miss Marple, for it suggested that Lady Catherine and Mrs. Hartwell had harbored some conflict that had not previously manifested in the investigation. When Miss Marple inquired regarding the nature of this conflict, Mary admitted that she possessed no definitive information but offered the speculation that it might concern Eleanor Bramwell and her relationship with Thomas Whitmore. This speculation, while perhaps somewhat crude in its reasoning, aligned remarkably well with the pattern of motivations that Miss Marple had been constructing. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had arranged a second conversation with Mrs. Hartwell, this time conducted at the vicarage rather than the more neutral territory of Mrs. Hartwell's sitting room. The vicar's wife, when confronted with Miss Marple's gentle but direct inquiry regarding our conversation with Lady Catherine, initially attempted to maintain the fiction that no significant discussion had occurred. However, faced with Miss Marple's patient yet immovable insistence, Mrs. Hartwell eventually admitted that Lady Catherine had discovered Eleanor and Thomas in a compromising situation during an earlier visit to the vicarage, and Lady Catherine had subsequently informed Mrs. Hartwell that she intended to inform Sir Geoffrey of his son's romantic entanglement with a woman of questionable reputation. This revelation represented a threat not only to Eleanor's remaining social standing, but also to Thomas's prospects for re-establishing himself within village society. Moreover, if Sir Geoffrey had been informed of Thomas's involvement with Eleanor, it was entirely plausible that he would have responded by terminating his son's allowance, thereby rendering Thomas's financial situation considerably more desperate than had previously been appreciated. Miss Marple pressed further regarding the content of Lady Catherine's threatened disclosure, and Mrs. Hartwell reluctantly acknowledged that Lady Catherine had been quite specific in her threat, mentioning that she intended to speak with Sir Geoffrey immediately following the Harvest Festival. This information suggested a clear timeline and an obvious motivation for Thomas to prevent such a conversation from occurring. However, Miss Marple's instincts continued to suggest that the solution remained incomplete, that some critical dimension of the crime remained obscured beneath layers of misdirection and partial truth. The question of the swan feather persisted, and Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that this peculiar detail represented not mere theatrical flourish, but rather a deliberate communication, a message directed towards someone specific who would recognize its significance. By early afternoon, Miss Marple had requested and obtained permission from Inspector Caldwell to conduct a more thorough examination of the parish hall, particularly the study in which Lady Catherine's body had been discovered. The inspector, somewhat reluctantly, authorized her access, though he appeared to regard her activities with the weary tolerance of a man who had learned through bitter experience that Miss Marple's seemingly random investigations occasionally produced results that justified their apparent illogic. Miss Marple spent nearly 2 hours in the study, examining the chaise lounge upon which Lady Catherine had been found, the desk belonging to Mrs. Hartwell, the arrangement of dried flowers and ornamental feathers in the small vase, and the general disposition of the room's contents. It was during this examination that her attention was drawn to a particular detail that seemed to have escaped everyone else's notice. The vase containing the ornamental feathers bore a maker's mark, indicating it had been recently purchased from a London supplier, a fact that was itself unremarkable except for the presence of a receipt, hastily concealed within the vase itself, indicating the purchase had been made by Eleanor Bramwell only 3 weeks prior. This detail, seemingly trivial in itself, suggested dimensions of premeditation that extended considerably further back than the immediate days preceding the murder. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had begun to perceive the outlines of a solution that differed markedly from the straightforward narrative of Thomas Whitmore's guilt that Inspector Caldwell appeared to be constructing. However, the solution that was beginning to crystallize in her mind possessed implications considerably more troubling than a simple case of a desperate young man poisoning his mother to improve his financial circumstances. The conspiracy that Miss Marple now suspected involved not merely Thomas Whitmore, but rather a carefully orchestrated collaboration between multiple individuals, each acting upon their own distinct motivations, yet collectively contributing toward Lady Catherine's destruction. The pale blue swan feather, Miss Marple now recognized with sudden clarity, represented not a random theatrical gesture, but rather a deliberate signature, a personal symbol that would convey information to those sufficiently perceptive to decode its meaning. This recognition prompted Miss Marple to formulate a question that would ultimately prove decisive in unraveling the true nature of the crime. The question that had begun to formulate in Miss Marple's mind concerned the precise nature of the relationship that existed between Sir Geoffrey Whitmore and Eleanor Bramwell, a relationship that had not previously occupied any significant position within the official investigation, but which now, under the clarifying light of Miss Marple's accumulated observations, suggested dimensions of considerable psychological and emotional complexity. During the late afternoon hours of that second day, Miss Marple arranged a brief conversation with Dr. Ashworth, ostensibly to inquire regarding his findings concerning Lady Catherine's death, but in reality to pursue a line of questioning that had only recently become apparent to her. During their consultation, conducted in the doctor's office with appropriate privacy, Miss Marple inquired whether Dr. Ashworth had observed any particular physical characteristics of Lady Catherine's body that might suggest information regarding her general health or personal circumstances. Dr. Ashworth, somewhat puzzled by this seemingly tangential inquiry, nevertheless provided the information that Lady Catherine had appeared to be in reasonably good health for a woman of her age, with one notable exception. She had given birth to a child at some point in her life, a fact evidenced by certain physical characteristics that remained apparent despite the passage of years. This revelation, while possibly unremarkable to most observers, represented to Miss Marple a detail of extraordinary significance, for Sir Geoffrey and Lady Catherine had been married for only 8 years, and the village possessed no knowledge of any children born to their union. The implication, which emerged with startling clarity, was that Lady Catherine had given birth to a child prior to her marriage to Sir Geoffrey, a circumstance that would have been regarded in earlier decades as a matter of considerable social scandal. Miss Marple's thoughts immediately gravitated toward the question of what had become of this child, and whether this individual might possess motivations relevant to understanding Lady Catherine's death. By evening of that day, Miss Marple had begun to formulate inquiries directed toward establishing the provenance of certain information regarding Sir Geoffrey's earlier life, details that had been largely subsumed beneath the more recent and prominent aspects of his existence as a prominent village figure. Through the mechanism of a carefully constructed telephone conversation with the County Records Office, Miss Marple ascertained that Sir Geoffrey had resided in London during a period extending some 35 years prior, at which time he had apparently maintained bachelor apartments in a respectable area of the city. This temporal coincidence, aligning as it did with the apparent age of Lady Catherine's prior offspring, suggested the possibility of a connection that demanded further investigation. The following morning, Miss Marple dispatched a carefully worded letter to an acquaintance residing in London, a former neighbour who had maintained connections within various circles of London society, and who might possess knowledge regarding Sir Geoffrey's activities and associations during the relevant period. While awaiting a response, Miss Marple continued her investigations within the village itself, conducting a series of seemingly casual conversations designed to extract information regarding Eleanor Bramwell's family background and personal history. Through these inquiries, a pattern began to emerge that suggested Eleanor's mother had passed away when Eleanor was quite young, a circumstance that had resulted in Eleanor's upbringing by her aunt, Mrs. Hartwell. The identity of Eleanor's father, however, remained conspicuously absent from the village's collective knowledge, a lacuna that Miss Marple found increasingly suggestive of deliberate concealment. By the afternoon of the third day following Lady Catherine's death, Miss Marple had received a response to her London inquiry, a letter containing information that confirmed her developing hypothesis with startling clarity. Eleanor Bramwell was apparently the daughter of a liaison between Sir Geoffrey Whitmore and a woman of modest circumstances during his extended residence in London, a relationship that had resulted in Eleanor's birth, and which Sir Geoffrey had apparently chosen to ignore or conceal throughout his subsequent life. Eleanor's mother had died when Eleanor was young, and responsibility for the child had devolved upon Eleanor's aunt, Mrs. Hartwell, who had raised her niece within the context of village society without apparently revealing the true identity of Eleanor's father. This revelation represented a crucial turning point in Miss Marple's understanding of the crime, for it suggested that Eleanor possessed a direct and powerful motivation for resenting Lady Catherine, who had apparently made no secret of her disapproval of Eleanor's romantic involvement with Thomas. If Lady Catherine had discovered Eleanor's true parentage, This knowledge would have represented a weapon of considerable potency, a fact that Lady Catherine appeared to have recognized with her threatened disclosure to Sir Geoffrey. Moreover, the discovery of Eleanor's parentage would have had profound implications for Thomas Whitmore, for it would have rendered his romantic involvement with Eleanor not merely socially inappropriate, but potentially incestuous, a reality that would have shattered any possibility of their future together. The pale blue swan feather suddenly assumed new significance in Miss Marple's understanding, for she recalled that Eleanor's mother, according to the information contained in her London correspondence, had been an artist of minor reputation who had specialized in watercolor paintings of English birds. Among Eleanor's mother's most frequently depicted subjects were swans, and it was entirely plausible that Eleanor possessed mementos or keepsakes from her mother's artistic endeavors, items that would have carried profound emotional significance. The feather, therefore, represented not merely a theatrical gesture, but rather a deeply personal statement, Eleanor's way of implicating her mother's memory in an act that was fundamentally about establishing Eleanor's right to existence and recognition within the family structure that Sir Geoffrey had constructed through his marriage to Lady Catherine by late afternoon. Miss Marple had arranged a meeting with Inspector Caldwell at the police station, her purpose being to communicate the results of her investigation and to suggest a revised interpretation of events that departed markedly from the inspector's prevailing theory regarding Thomas Whitmore's guilt. Inspector Caldwell's initial response to Miss Marple's hypothesis was one of considerable skepticism, for the theory she presented lacked the straightforward clarity of a simple murder motivated by financial desperation. Inspector Caldwell listened to Miss Marple's exposition with the patient forbearance of a man who had learned through necessity to respect conclusions that, while initially appearing implausible, had proven remarkably accurate in their fundamental accuracy. However, as Miss Marple elaborated upon her theory regarding Eleanor's true parentage and the subsequent implications for her motivation to murder Lady Catherine, the inspector's skepticism gradually metamorphosed into reluctant acknowledgement that the theory possessed a coherence and explanatory power that his prevailing hypothesis lacked. The critical distinction, Miss Marple explained, was that Eleanor possessed not merely a singular motivation, but rather multiple overlapping reasons for wishing Lady Catherine's death, reasons that intertwined in complex fashion around themes of personal recognition, romantic possibility, and the fundamental human desire to be acknowledged by one's biological parent. Lady Catherine had represented an obstacle to Eleanor's aspirations on multiple levels. She had threatened to reveal Eleanor's origins to Sir Geoffrey, thereby forcing acknowledgement of Eleanor's existence, whether Sir Geoffrey desired such acknowledgement or not, and she had simultaneously threatened to prevent Eleanor's romantic involvement with Thomas through her threatened disclosure to Sir Geoffrey. The convergence of these multiple motivations, Miss Marple suggested, would have created in Eleanor's mind a compelling psychological imperative toward eliminating the obstacle that Lady Catherine represented. Inspector Caldwell, somewhat reluctantly, agreed to pursue this revised line of investigation, though he continued to harbor reservations regarding the evidentiary foundation upon which Miss Marple's hypothesis rested. The inspector observed, with considerable justification, that while Eleanor's motivations might be psychologically compelling, the actual physical evidence connecting Eleanor to the poisoning remained circumstantial and subject to alternative interpretation. This observation prompted Miss Marple to suggest that a critical missing element of evidence might be discovered through careful examination of Eleanor's residence, specifically directing Inspector Caldwell's attention toward the likelihood that Eleanor would have retained mementos, or keepsake, from her mother's artistic endeavors, items that would correspond to the pale blue swan feather discovered upon Lady Catherine's pillow. Armed with a search warrant obtained through careful presentation of Miss Marple's hypothesis to the magistrate, Inspector Caldwell and his constable arrived at the small cottage where Eleanor Bramwell maintained her residence on the morning of the 4th day following Lady Catherine's death. The search, conducted with meticulous attention to detail, revealed within Eleanor's bedroom a small wooden box containing an extensive collection of feathers, all rendered pale blue through artistic treatment, along with several of her mother's watercolor paintings depicting swans in various attitudes and settings. More significantly, the search revealed among Eleanor's personal effects a small notebook containing entries that, while not constituting a confession, suggested Eleanor's psychological state during the weeks preceding Lady Catherine's death. The entries expressed Eleanor's anguish regarding her romantic feelings for Thomas, her growing awareness that Lady Catherine represented a threat to her happiness, and ultimately, in entries dated only 2 days before the murder, Eleanor's apparent decision to eliminate this threat through means that the notebook did not explicitly specify, but which was sufficiently clear in their implication to constitute incriminating evidence. Eleanor's arrest on the morning of the 4th day following Lady Catherine's death precipitated a crisis within the village that transcended the mere resolution of a criminal investigation and extended into the profound moral and social dimensions that murder inevitably generates. Mrs. Hartwell, when informed of her niece's arrest and the revelation of Eleanor's true parentage, experienced a collapse of emotional proportions that required medical intervention, while Sir Geoffrey withdrew into a state of apparent catatonia from which he proved difficult to rouse. Thomas Whitmore, faced with the revelation that his romantic involvement had unwittingly contributed to the murder of his own mother, experienced a trauma of such profound nature that he departed the village within the day, his ultimate destination and subsequent circumstances remaining unknown to the village's population. The village itself underwent a transformation in the wake of Eleanor's arrest, as though the revelation of the crime's true nature had fundamentally altered the community's understanding of itself and its inhabitants. The carefully maintained facade of respectability and propriety that had characterized Ashford-upon-Meadow's social structure proved to have concealed depths of human motivation far more complex and troubling than the village's conventional morality had been prepared to acknowledge. Miss Marple, reflecting upon these developments in the quietude of her sitting room several days after Eleanor's arrest, contemplated the peculiar paradoxes that the investigation had illuminated regarding human nature and social convention. Eleanor's actions, while undoubtedly criminal and deserving of legal consequences, had emerged from psychological circumstances that invited a degree of sympathy alongside moral condemnation. Eleanor had been denied acknowledgement of her fundamental identity, had been forced to construct an existence based upon concealment and social marginalization, and had been further threatened with the destruction of the one romantic connection that offered the possibility of transcendence from her predetermined social position. These circumstances did not justify murder, Miss Marple recognized with clarity, but they rendered the crime comprehensible as an expression of desperate human need rather than as the act of a moral aberration. Inspector Caldwell, in his final report to Miss Marple, acknowledged his initial reluctance to accept her hypothesis and expressed his professional respect for her investigative acuity. However, he observed that Eleanor's case presented a profound challenge to conventional legal and moral frameworks, for while Eleanor had undoubtedly administered the poison that had resulted in Lady Catherine's death, the question of whether Eleanor bore sole responsibility for the crime proved considerably more complex when one considered the roles that Sir Geoffrey's abandonment, Mrs. Hartwell's concealment, and Lady Catherine's threatened revelations had all played in creating the psychological circumstances that had culminated in murder. The trial of Eleanor Bramwell occurred 3 months following her arrest, conducted in the county courthouse with the substantial attendance that cases of social prominence inevitably generate. Miss Marple attended the proceedings in person, her observation of the legal machinery in operation revealing dimensions of the criminal justice system that extended considerably beyond the mere establishment of guilt or innocence. Eleanor appeared in the courtroom with a composed demeanor that suggested either profound resignation or a degree of psychological detachment from the proceedings, her responses to questioning delivered in measured tones that betrayed little emotional content. The prosecution's case, built substantially upon the evidence that Miss Marple's investigation had uncovered, proceeded with methodical precision, establishing Eleanor's access to the poisoned tarts, her knowledge of Lady Catherine's dietary preferences, and most significantly, her possession of the pale blue swan feathers that connected her directly to the crime scene. The defense counsel, apparently recognizing the inadequacy of challenging the factual evidence against L.A. Anna, instead pursued a strategy focused upon psychological mitigation, presenting expert testimony regarding Eleanor's emotional development under conditions of social stigma and concealment. Miss Marple observed that this defensive strategy, while perhaps strategically sound, served to illuminate the precise psychological mechanisms through which Eleanor's crime had emerged, rendering visible the internal landscape of desperation and resentment that had motivated her actions. During a recess in the trial proceedings, Miss Marple was approached by Bernard Thorne, the village solicitor, who requested a private conversation regarding matters that extended beyond the immediate trial circumstances. In a quiet corner of the courthouse, Mr. Thorne revealed information that had been withheld from the official investigation, circumstances that had been constrained by the bonds of professional confidentiality, but which Mr. Thorne now felt compelled to communicate. Sir Geoffrey, according to Mr. Thorne, had been aware of Eleanor's true parentage for considerably longer than the official investigation had suggested, having discovered the truth approximately 2 years prior through examination of certain financial records that had revealed Mrs. Hartwell's continued expenditures on Eleanor's behalf. Rather than acknowledging this discovery or taking action upon it, Sir Geoffrey had apparently chosen to ignore the matter, a decision that had allowed the situation to deteriorate into the circumstances that had ultimately culminated in murder. This revelation, while not altering the legal facts of Eleanor's culpability, suggested dimensions of moral responsibility that extended considerably beyond Eleanor herself, and implicated Sir Geoffrey in a subtle yet unmistakable fashion as a contributing factor in the crime's eventual commission. The trial's conclusion came after 3 weeks of testimony and deliberation, resulting in Eleanor's conviction on the charge of murder. However, the sentencing phase of the proceedings revealed a complexity that suggested the judiciary's recognition that Eleanor's circumstances extended beyond conventional moral categories. Rather than imposing a sentence of life imprisonment, the judge sentenced Eleanor to 15 years with the possibility of eventual parole, a sentence that suggested judicial recognition of the mitigating circumstances surrounding the crime while simultaneously maintaining the necessity of legal accountability. Miss Marple observed this sentencing with her customary composed demeanor, though her expression suggested a degree of ambivalence regarding whether justice had been adequately served through the legal process. The immediate aftermath of the trial witnessed the dispersal of the principal actors in the drama that had unfolded across the preceding months. Sir Geoffrey, his reputation irreparably damaged by the revelation of his illegitimate daughter and his apparent knowledge of Eleanor's existence without acknowledgement, withdrew from public life and eventually departed the village for residence in London, his subsequent fate and circumstances remaining unknown to Ashford-upon-Meadows' population. Mrs. Hartwell, burdened by her complicity in the concealment that had contributed to Eleanor's crime, experienced a marked decline in health and vitality, her position within village society fundamentally altered by the revelation of her knowledge and her 30-year participation in the deception that had formed the foundation of Eleanor's existence. Thomas Whitmore, having departed the village immediately following his mother's death, remained absent from Ashford-upon-Meadow and established residence in a distant county, his subsequent life passing entirely beyond the scope of village Nold. G.E. or observation. The village itself underwent a gradual metamorphosis in the wake of these developments, as though the trauma of Eleanor's crime had fundamentally altered its collective consciousness and its capacity to maintain the illusions of respectability and propriety that had characterized its prior existence. The comfortable certainties that had previously defined village life, the assumption that social stability rested upon firm foundations, that the respectable classes possessed inherent moral superiority, that careful observation of social convention provided sufficient basis for ethical conduct, all proved to have been substantially illusory, shattered by the revelation of depths of human complexity and moral ambiguity that the village's conventional frameworks had failed to acknowledge. Miss Marple, in the months following Eleanor's conviction and sentencing, found herself the subject of considerable attention from various residents of Ashford-upon-Meadow, as though her successful resolution of the crime had transformed her into a figure of almost mystical significance, a repository of wisdom regarding the hidden complexities of human nature. However, Miss Marple herself appeared increasingly inclined toward philosophical reflection regarding the nature of justice and moral responsibility. Contemplations that suggested her investigation of Eleanor's crime had left her with more questions than answers regarding the proper distribution of blame among the multiple actors who had contributed to Lady Catherine's death. During one conversation with Mary Fellows conducted several weeks after Eleanor's sentencing, Miss Marple observed that the legal system had necessarily focused upon Eleanor's individual culpability, and had therefore inevitably overlooked the broader systemic dimensions of the crime. The societal mechanisms through which illegitimate children were denied recognition, through which women were rendered economically dependent upon men, through which romantic possibilities were constrained by rigid social hierarchies. Eleanor's crime, Miss Marple suggested, represented not merely an individual moral aberration, but rather the inevitable consequence of social structures that had systematically denied Eleanor's fundamental humanity and her right to self-determination. The autumn of the following year arrived with a quality of temporal indifference that seemed to render Eleanor Bramwell's imprisonment into something almost abstract, a historical event that had transpired in a previous era rather than merely 12 months prior. Miss Marple, now in her 85th year, had continued to reside in her cottage in Ashford-upon-Meadow, maintaining her customary routines of gardening, knitting, and the quiet observation of village life that had become the defining characteristic of her extended existence. However, the village itself had undergone a transformation that suggested Eleanor's crime had fundamentally altered the community's capacity for self-deception regarding its own moral complexities. The comfortable certainties that had previously characterized village social life had given way to a more nuanced and considerably less pleasant awareness of human motivation and the capacity for moral compromise that existed even among the village's most respectable inhabitants. Inspector Caldwell, whose investigation of Eleanor's crime had been marked by his eventual recognition of Miss Marple's superior insight into the psychological dimensions of the matter, made an unexpected visit to Miss Marple's cottage on a grey afternoon in October, his demeanour suggesting the presence of information of considerable significance. The inspector revealed that he had received, through official channels, communication from Eleanor herself, a letter that had been addressed to Miss Marple, and which Eleanor had requested be delivered through the constabulary's offices, rather than through direct postal transmission. Inspector Caldwell expressed considerable curiosity regarding the contents of Eleanor's correspondence, though he acknowledged that professional ethics precluded his examination of private communication addressed to another individual. Miss Marple accepted the letter with a sense of both anticipation and profound melancholy, recognizing that Eleanor's written words would constitute a direct engagement across the barriers that legal conviction and imprisonment had established. The letter, written in Eleanor's careful and deliberate handwriting, contained a confession of a somewhat different character than the legal confession that had been extracted during the trial proceedings. Eleanor wrote, with considerable candor, that she had deliberately poisoned Lady Catherine with full awareness of the consequences that her actions would inevitably generate. However, Eleanor elaborated, the poisoning had not been motivated solely by the immediate personal grievances that the trial had emphasized, but rather by a more fundamental recognition that Lady Catherine's death represented the only mechanism through which Eleanor could force acknowledgement of her own existence and her right to recognition as a member of the Whitmore family. Eleanor wrote that she had long understood that her biological father, Sir Geoffrey, would never voluntarily acknowledge her existence or her kinship to his legitimate family, and that Lady Catherine's threatened revelations regarding Eleanor's parentage and her romantic involvement with Thomas had represented a final catalyst toward action. Most significantly, Eleanor revealed in her letter that she had deliberately arranged to place the pale blue swan feather up on Lady Catherine's pillow, knowing that this action would inevitably draw Miss Marple's attention and would set in motion the investigation that had ultimately resulted in Eleanor's exposure and imprisonment. Eleanor's intention, she explained, had not been to escape detection but rather to ensure that the truth regarding her parentage and her motivations would be thoroughly investigated and made public, thereby forcing the village and her biological father to acknowledge the existence and the human reality of Eleanor Bramwell. This revelation suggested dimensions of Eleanor's psychological state that transcended conventional categories of criminal motivation and suggested that Eleanor had committed her crime not merely to eliminate an obstacle, but rather as a form of desperate communication, a final assertion of her right to existence and recognition that could no longer be denied or concealed through the mechanisms of social convention. Miss Marple, upon reading Eleanor's letter, found herself confronted with a profound moral and philosophical quandary regarding the nature of justice and the proper evaluation of Eleanor's culpability. Eleanor had committed an act of undeniable criminality, yet her motivation had extended considerably beyond the psychological categories that conventional legal analysis could adequately encompass. Eleanor had, in effect, sacrificed her own freedom and future not merely to eliminate Lady Catherine, but rather to force recognition of truths that the respectable society of Ashford-upon-Meadow had labored for decades to conceal. This realization prompted Miss Marple to take an action that represented a departure from her customary practice of non-interference in legal and official matters. She composed a detailed letter to the judge who had presided over Eleanor's trial, providing her analysis of Eleanor's psychological circumstances and H.E.R. assessment that Eleanor's crime represented not the act of a fundamentally immoral individual, but rather the desperate assertion of a human being whose fundamental right to recognition had been systematically denied through her entire existence. Miss Marple's letter did not request Eleanor's immediate release, but rather suggested that the psychological and moral dimensions of Eleanor's case warranted re-examination and might justify eventual reconsideration of her sentence through official channels of appeal or clemency. The letter, while not generating immediate legal consequences, proved influential in shaping subsequent official attitudes toward Eleanor's case and contributed eventually to Eleanor's release on parole after serving only 8 years of her 15-year sentence. However, the most profound consequence of Eleanor's letter and Miss Marple's subsequent intervention was not the immediate legal outcome, but rather Miss Marple's own philosophical evolution regarding the nature of justice, morality, and the proper evaluation of human conduct. Miss Marple recognized, with a clarity that had perhaps eluded her during the active investigation, that the conventional categories through which society evaluated criminal conduct frequently masked more complex moral realities regarding culpability, motivation, and the systemic circumstances that shaped individual choices. Eleanor's crime, viewed from this broader perspective, represented not merely an individual moral aberration, but rather an expression of the violent pressures that accumulated when human beings were systematically denied recognition of their fundamental existence and their right to self-determination. The winter following Eleanor's release on parole arrived with unusual severity, as though the season itself had absorbed the lingering melancholy that Eleanor's crime and its aftermath had generated within the village consciousness. Miss Marple, now in her 86th year, and increasingly aware of the finite nature of her remaining existence, found herself engaged in a comprehensive reassessment of the investigation and its implications that extended considerably beyond the immediate resolution of Lady Catherine's murder. The case had proven to be considerably more complex than the straightforward narrative of criminal motivation that conventional investigative procedure had initially suggested, and Miss Marple recognized that her understanding of human nature and the circumstances that shaped individual moral choices had undergone a subtle but profound transformation through her engagement with Eleanor's particular circumstances. Eleanor herself, upon her release from incarceration, had chosen to remain in a distant county rather than return to Ashford-upon-Meadow, establishing residence in a modest cottage near the coastal town of Brighton, where she had apparently begun to construct a life independent of the village context that had generated such profound psychological damage. Through the mechanism of occasional correspondence with Miss Marple, Eleanor had revealed that her years of imprisonment, while undoubtedly traumatic, had provided her with extended opportunity for psychological contemplation and moral reflection regarding the crime she had committed and the systemic circumstances that had motivated it. Eleanor had undertaken substantial educational pursuits during her incarceration, had developed considerable facility with written expression, and had ultimately contributed articles regarding the psychology of female criminality to several academic journals, work that had gained modest recognition within scholarly circles. This transformation of Eleanor from criminal to scholar and social commentator seemed to Miss Marple to represent a form of redempti. On that, transcended the conventional legal categories through which society typically evaluated such matters, suggesting that human beings possessed a capacity for moral and intellectual development, even in circumstances of profound adversity and constraint. Sir Geoffrey Whitmore, whose deliberate concealment of his knowledge regarding Eleanor's existence had contributed substantially to the psychological circumstances that had culminated in Lady Catherine's death, had withdrawn into increasing social isolation in his London residence. Miss Marple's occasional contacts with individuals who had maintained acquaintance with Sir Geoffrey suggested that the former banking magnate had experienced a marked decline in both physical and psychological well-being, his final years characterized by a growing awareness of his own moral culpability in the tragedy that had unfolded in Ashford-upon-Meadow. Sir Geoffrey's death occurring approximately 2 years following Eleanor's release on parole generated in Miss Marple a complex mixture of emotions that seemed to resist simple categorization as either satisfaction at moral justice or sympathy for human suffering. The death of Sir Geoffrey, while not altering the facts of Eleanor's crime or the legal consequences that had flowed from her actions, nonetheless suggested the operation of moral forces that extended considerably beyond the formal mechanisms of the criminal justice system. Mrs. Hartwell, Eleanor's aunt, and the individual whose 30-year participation in Eleanor's concealment had contributed substantially to the psychological damage that had motivated the crime, had experienced a gradual deterioration in both physical and mental faculties following the revelation of Eleanor's true parentage. Miss Marple had observed during the final years of Mrs. Hartwell's life that the former vicar's wife appeared to be engaged in a continuous process of moral reckoning, contemplating the consequences of the choices she had made regarding Eleanor's upbringing and her participation in the systematic concealment of Eleanor's fundamental identity. Mrs. Hartwell's death, occurring in the spring following Eleanor's release on parole, seemed to Miss Marple to represent a form of closure regarding the multiple dimensions of tragedy that Eleanor's crime had generated. The village of Ashford-upon-Meadow itself, in the years following Eleanor's release and the deaths of Sir Geoffrey and Mrs. Hartwell, underwent a gradual transformation that suggested the community's capacity for moral learning and collective self-examination. The comfortable assumptions regarding social respectability and moral superiority that had characterized the village's prior existence proved increasingly difficult to maintain in light of the revelations that Eleanor's crime had generated. A younger generation of villagers, unconstrained by the social conventions that had bound their elders, began to question the moral foundations upon which the village's social hierarchy had been constructed, asking uncomfortable questions regarding the mechanisms through which respectability had been maintained through systematic concealment and denial. Miss Marple, reflecting upon these developments in the quietude of her cottage during the final months of her life, recognized that Eleanor's crime and its aftermath had generated consequences that extended far beyond the immediate legal resolution and touched upon fundamental questions regarding justice, morality, and the proper organization of human society. Eleanor's letter, which Miss Marple had preserved carefully throughout the years following its receipt, had demonstrated a remarkable capacity for moral honesty and philosophical sophistication, suggesting that Eleanor had utilized her years of imprisonment not merely as punishment, but rather as opportunity for profound personal transformation and intellectual development. The case had taught Miss Marple that conventional categories of crime and criminality frequently masked more complex moral realities, that individuals who committed undeniable acts of criminality might nonetheless possess profound humanity and capacity for redemptive moral growth. and that the mechanisms through which society typically evaluated and punished criminal conduct frequently failed to acknowledge the systemic circumstances that shaped individual choices. In her final letter to Eleanor, composed during the winter preceding Miss Marple's death, the elderly detective wrote that she had come to recognize Eleanor's crime not merely as an act of individual moral aberration, but rather as a tragic expression of the pressures that accumulated when human beings were systematically denied recognition of their fundamental existence and their right to self-determination. Miss Marple acknowledged that Eleanor had committed an act of undeniable criminality, yet she also recognized that the broader circumstances surrounding Eleanor's life and choices had been shaped by forces and systems that extended considerably beyond Eleanor's individual moral agency. The case of Lady Catherine Whitmore's murder, resolved through Miss Marple's patient observation and psychological insight, had ultimately revealed not merely the identity of the murderer, but rather profound truths regarding the nature of human society and the complex intersections between individual morality and systemic injustice that shaped the tragic dramas through which human communities expressed their deepest conflicts and moral contradictions.